Mass media, especially television, is an extremely influential force in today's world, where television is easily accessible. News programs and other television shows in the United States seem to always have a story relating to terrorism. Most television networks seem to be obsessed with running stories about terrorism and terrorist groups. Citizens are justly frightened by what they see and hear about terrorism through mass media because they perceive this as reality. Messages and pictures of terrorism seem all too real when they are on a TV screen in someone's living room. Stories of terrorism seem to surround American citizens of all ages every time they turn on the TV or radio. Mass media and government escalate public panic about terrorism by sensationalizing reports of terrorism, publishing vague warnings of imminent attacks, and by creating an us versus them mentality using racial grammar. First, the media escalates public panic by sensationalizing acts of terror. This is not a hard thing to do, and it happens quite often on television news programs. To sensationalize terrorism means to describe or show it in a way that makes it seem more appalling than it really is. In other words, the news exaggerates reports of terrorism. For example, in 2015, Americans were more likely to be killed for being Muslim than by a Muslim. In the United States, roughly 14,000 people are murdered each year, yet the news seems to be fixated on Islamic terrorism. According to the Center for Research on Globalization, only 17 Americans died worldwide from terrorist attacks in 2011. Their website states that Americans are more likely to get struck by lightning than to get killed by a terrorist, and 33,842 times more likely to die from cancer than a terrorist attack. An American is even 23,528 times more likely to die from obesity than an act of terrorism. Contrary to what the news might portray, there are countless threats to American lives, and terrorism plays an extremely small role. In a Washington Post poll, 90% of respondents say the Islamic State is a somewhat to very serious threat to the United States. A poll by CNN found that 70% of respondents believe that ISIS has the ability to launch an attack on the U.S. There must be a sensible reason for the public to feel this strongly about terrorism, even though the threat of terrorism realistically poses almost no harm to Americans. Not surprisingly, mass media seems to be a solid reason why the American public is so scared of terrorism, a threat that really isn't much of a threat at all. In a time span of just about 2 weeks, CNN mentioned Islamic terrorism about 3,800 times. Most people would probably agree that this seems a bit excessive unless there was a genuine, concrete threat. Previously self-credentialed terrorism expert Stephen Emerson appeared on Fox News and alleged things that were highly disputable and overly exaggerated.
And in Britain, it's not just no-go zones. There are actual cities like Birmingham that are totally Muslim, where non-Muslims just simply don't go in. And parts of London, there are actually Muslim religious police that actually beat and actually wound seriously anyone who doesn't dress according to religious Muslim attire.
Emerson even made comments about Islamic terrorism in the U.S. after the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. He said that the attack was meant to inflict as many casualties as possible, and that this is a Middle Eastern trait. A reporter for the New York Times, A.M. Rosenthal, wrote articles sensationalizing terrorism and supporting Emerson's extreme statements. Rosenthal even supported the false idea that the bombing in Oklahoma City was done by a Muslim terrorist. Of course, the bombing in Oklahoma City was indeed not done by an Islamic terrorist, but rather a domestic, homegrown terrorist. Fox brought another so-called terrorism expert, Nolan Peterson, on air to spread more scary ideas. He proclaimed that some areas in Paris were ruled so strictly by Islamic law that the police were afraid to enter. Terrorism threats in the United States seem to be such a big deal because they are all over the major news networks constantly. These are just a few examples of how the media sensationalizes terrorism and scares the public. Additionally, the government also has a part in frightening the public. The Homeland Security Advisory System is a way to distribute information regarding the risk of terrorist attacks and was introduced by the Bush administration in 2002. The system uses color-coded threat levels that seem almost worthless because they give no instruction to the public on how to take action. They don't tell people what they can do, they just make people afraid. Clearly frightened, many New Yorkers even reported having nightmares of choking to death on poisonous vapors in their own homes when Color Code Orange was declared. These government reports seem to cause more hysteria than explanation. Whether or not it was intended to frighten the public, it still provoked meaningless panic. Publishing vague warnings of terrorist attacks is another way that public panic is motivated. FEMA officials told reporters that citizens should buy rolls of duct tape and plastic sheeting to seal off rooms in the event of a chemical weapons assault. TV news took off with this statement, and by the next day, stores in New York and Washington were running out of water and duct tape. Officials issued a warning of vague and unverified threats against the Brooklyn Bridge and the Statue of Liberty in 2002. Police Commissioner Raymond W. Kelly referred to the information as general threats to New York City, but had no specifics about the plan, no estimated time, and no likely method of attack. Warnings of terrorist activity came after Secretary of Defense Donald H. Rumsfeld said that terrorists would unavoidably get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. Television is an important part of American culture, and countless people consume the messages broadcast through it. Many instances are documented where the idea of terrorism was sensationalized and misrepresented by TV personalities. Whether it's from publishing vague warnings, sensationalizing stories, or using racial grammar, the influence on America is apparent. The public is afraid.